Okay, so today's recording now in advance the Daf Yomi for Shabbos, and so the Daf Yomi is basically where we left this off. Was we've been in a discussion of four different approaches as to when the person who was a Nazir who became Tameh, when does he start his? If he becomes Tameh, he loses his count. If he had been counting his days of his Nazir, he has to start over. So we saw four opinions as to when he starts over, when he can resume his count. Excuse me. The first opinion, which is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer, recorded differently, attributed to different people, is when he starts on the seventh day after he became Tameh, went through the purification process. He had the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on him on day 3 and day 7. Day 7, he gets a haircut and he starts to count his Naziris again. Then we had the position of Rebbe, and he starts to count on the morning of day 8, as soon as it's day 8. Then we had the position of the Rabbanon, and he starts to count after he brings the Chatos, because on day 8 he has to bring 3 karbanos, the Chatos, the Asham, and the Oah. So the Rabbanon say he starts to count as soon as he has brought the Chatos, the bird that's the Chatos offering, the sin offering. Only then can he start moving towards his Naziris. And then we had the position of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan Broka, who says that he starts to count after he brings the Asham. And the Gemara, so then he starts to count. Those are the four opinions. The Gemara says, well, why do the Rabbanan say after he brings the Chatas? Because that pasuk that says he resumes his count says Bayomahu. And Bayomahu is coming to exclude the Asham. And the Gemara says, well, why does Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan Broka say you only count after the Asham? What does he say it excludes? He says Bayomahu excludes the Oah, that you start to count even before the Oah is brought. But the Rabbanan say, back to Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan Broka, we don't need to exclude the Oah because the Oah is not an impediment to the spiritual advancement of the Nazir for him to start again, because the Oah is just a Doron Ba'alma, it's just a gift. It's not a sin offering. And so therefore the Rabbanan say we use Bayomahu to limit the Asham, whereas Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan Broka says we need Bayomahu to limit the Oah. So on today's Daf Yomi, the Gemara says, 4 lines from the top, Man Tana Lahadatan Rabbanan. Who's the author of the following brisa? Isha Shenadra. Now, of course, this will be familiar to you because we had this in Nedarim. Isha Shenadra ben Nazir. We had this at the end of Nedarim. A woman who takes a vow to be a Nazirite, Vinitma'a, and she became Tameh. So you would think that she'd have to bring the 3 karbanos, the chatos, the asham, and the oah. But she became her husband revoked her vow. So then mivia chatas ha'of, she has to bring the chatas. Meina mivia oas of. She has to bring the chatas, but she doesn't bring the oah. Now a chatas, generally speaking, is not brought voluntarily. So we're going to have to figure out why, if her vow is revoked, does she have to still bring the chatas? But she doesn't bring the oah. And the reason why she doesn't bring the oah, the Gemara assumes, is because the oah is a sin offering, and since the vow is revoked, she hasn't committed a sin. And so, who is the one who says that the oah is a sin offering? It's not the Rabbanan, but it's Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan Broka, because he needs the pasuk of Bayomahu to limit the oah. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, that's Rabbi Shmuel. So he says that's the position of Rabbi Shmuel. He says, how do you know it's the position of Rabbi? So because he says you need Bayomahu to limit the oah, because the oah is a sin offering. So the Gemara says, my kasavar, what's the position of Rabbi Shmuel? He kasavar bal miaker aker. So the Gemara says we don't understand Rabbi Shmuel's position, because if he's saying that the oah is a sin offering and therefore you need Bayomahu to limit it, and that's why she doesn't bring the oah, then why does she bring the chatas ha'of? So that's what the Gemara asks. What's Rabbi Shmuel's position? What does he hold? If he says that the husband is really uprooting the vow, then the chatas ha'of he should also not bring. Means that if she's not guilty of anything because she didn't do a sin, then why does she bring the chatas ha'of? And the Gemara says, and Ikosavar Bal Megas guy is if he says the husband doesn't uproot the vow retroactively, then, and meaning it's just from this point on, she's not a Nazirite, then Olas Ov Nami Laisi, then she committed a sin, so she should have to bring the Olas Ov. So the Gemara explains, so really, Rabbi Yishmael's other position that really uproots the vow. So she doesn't bring the Olas Ov because it's being brought for a sin, and so therefore, for that reason, she doesn't bring the Olas. So then why does she bring the Chatas? So the Gemara explains that he says you should bring the Chatas because Rabbi Shmuel Savrak Rabbi Lazar HaKapar. Rabbi Shmuel's other position like Rabbi Lazar the Kapar, who says the Tanya Rabbi Lazar Kapar, but Rabbi Omer, Matam Omer v'chiper alav me'asher chata al nefesh. Why does the pasuk say in respect to this woman who or a Nazir became tamei? Why does it say he has to bring an atonement for his sin? What was his sin? His sin was that he withheld from wine. So Rabbi Lazar HaKapar is saying that the sin of the Nazirite is because he withheld from wine. So this woman too, even though her vow was revoked and she was no longer a Nazir to get the sin of becoming Tameh while she was a Nazira, she still committed the sin that for a period of time she withheld from wine. And for that reason, she needs to bring a sin. For that reason, she has to bring the Chatos Ha'ov. And the Gemara says, Ukal v'chomer. Yeah, my father has a question. You're on mute. You're on mute, Abba.
If she makes a vow that she's not going to become Tameh, and she's of that age where she becomes a Nida, so how could she make that vow?
She didn't make a vow that she's not going to become Tameh. She made a vow that she's going to be a Nazir.
Well, a Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh.
No, a Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh Mace. But a Nazir there's no prohibition for a Nazir becoming other types of Tumah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so thanks for clarifying that. So that's why, of course, a woman can become a Nazir. So the point was, so because she withheld from the wine, that's why she has to bring the Chatas Ha'of. So the Gemara says, and the Gemara tells us the Kal V'chomer, just like this person who only refrained from wine is called a sinner. This is just a general statement that the Gemara is telling us. And just like this person who only refrained from wine is called a sinner. Kal V'chomer, the Talmud is telling us how much more so is somebody who sits and fasts in this world, somebody who refrains from everything, how much more so are they called a sinner? And that's why Rabbi Yishmael says that you bring the Chatas Ha'ov, but not the Osov. She was bringing the Chatas Ha'ov because she didn't drink wine for a period of time, and she was doing these things which she shouldn't, refraining from these things which she shouldn't have been doing. So the Gemara says, but I don't understand. So the Gemara says, I don't understand why Rabbi Lazar HaKapar needs to cite this verse that a Nazir brings is a sinner, where Rabbi Lazar HaKapar is saying even if a Nazir never became Tameh, he's a sinner. But the pasuk which he's saying to say he's a sinner is about is a person who's Tameh. So why is that a proof for somebody who's Tahor is also a sinner? So the Gemara says, because Rabbi Lazar HaKapar Nazir Tahor Nami Chotu. Rabbi Lazar HaKapar is in the position that a Nazir who commits a sin, a Nazir who never becomes Tameh is also a sinner. So why does the verse say that this law by a Nazir Tameh who commits a sin? Why does it say it there? All the Shana B'chait, because that person commits two sins. One, the sin is that they became a Nazir, and then secondly, that they put themselves in a situation where they could become Tameh. So therefore, the pasuk says it there. But really, a Nazir Tahor, according to Rabbi Lazar HaKapar, is a sinner. And this is the central idea of Rabbi Lazar HaKapar. He says we were put on this world to enjoy the world. We were put on the world to appreciate it in good measure, to drink wine on Shabbos, on special events. And by a person who's refraining and just sitting and fasting all day, this is a person who's not appreciating the blessings of Hashem's world. So now the Talmud has said, the Mishnah said that if a person accepted Naziris while they're in a cemetery, then it doesn't start counting towards their days of Naziris. But if they go out and then they come back in, it does start. So the Gemara says, if they go out of the cemetery and then they come back in, it counts towards the minyan. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara is bothered by this question. The Gemara has a problem, meaning to say it says, from the fact that it says that we're talking about a case where the person goes out and comes back in within the 7 days. So he's never become purified. So the question the Gemara asks is, Mishum diyatza chal Nazir. It's just because he went out one time, he's still tamei. So why does he say that he's a Nazir? So Amar Shmuel could go in shiyatza v'hiza v'shana v'tavel. So Shmuel said, no, he went out of the cemetery and he went through the purification process. That's why we start to count towards the minyan. So the Gemara says, you mean to say only if he goes back into the cemetery can we start counting? But if he doesn't go back into the cemetery, we can't start counting towards the Naziris? That doesn't make sense. Gemara says, no, lomi bai kamer. No, this is what the type of Mishnah is saying. It's a lomi bai. Not only this, but even this. Lomi bai yatsa. Not only if he went out, not only in a situation where he went out from the cemetery and didn't go in a second time, but he went in only the next day, that we count him, we start counting. But even if he went back in that same day, it's going to start counting that part of the day for a minyan. And after he becomes tahor, he has to bring the carbon tuma. And the chiddush is that even though at the start of the day he went in, and in the end of the day he was tamei, meaning at the start of the day he was tamei, at the end of the day he was tamei, and only in the middle of the day he was tahor. We might have said that we shouldn't say miksa sayom kukua, portion days, like the whole day when it refers to just in the middle of the day. Nevertheless, Tosfos explains that the Tana is teaching us that it's going to be considered like he was tahor, and he has to bring a carbon tuma after all become purified. So then the Gemara says, Amrulei, Rav Kahana Ravasi Rav, my timer. So the Gemara says that Rav Kahana Ravasi said to Rav, my timer will mefrashaslan kahalan. How come you didn't explain to us this exactly the same way Shmuel explained it to his students? Why didn't you give us this explanation? Amar Lahon, he said to them, Amina domalo tzrichusu. He said, I thought maybe you're not going to need it to be explained because it was so obvious. So the teachers are saying, the students are saying, why didn't you explain? He said, I thought it was so obvious you wouldn't need it. This is the Musar Haskel for the teachers and for the students. Teachers should never assume that their students can know something so obviously, and the students should not be insulted when their teachers don't explain something the right way. So now the Gemara is going to go back and understand the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, not on that day that he goes back in, will he become, not on that day. According to the Mishnah, we learned if a person leaves the cemetery, he becomes purified, and then enters back into the cemetery. So then when he becomes purified, he has to bring the carbon tumah, even if he, on the same day he entered, was the day he got purified. Rabbi Eliezer says no. If he goes back in that same day, he doesn't bring the carbon tumah, because that the earlier days will fall means to say you need more than one day, otherwise you don't bring the carbon tuma. So the Gemara says in this context, says the Gemara, when does Rabbi Eliezer say his words that the earlier days you don't bring the carbon tuma unless you have at least 2 days of Nazirus and Tahara? That's only by a Tamei Nazir, by a person who was in the cemetery, but he was Tamei when he accepted the Nazirus, and he goes out and becomes pure, and then he comes back in. But Nazir Tahor Shenidma, but if he was initially a Nazir who was Tahor, I feel Yom Echad, even if it was just the first day and he comes in contact with the dead body, so there, he knocks out the earlier day and he has to bring a carbon tumah. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, my time. Rava says, what's the reasoning for Rabbi Eliezer, who says only by a tamei shenazir do we say is din? Mishum de betuma ki. So it says Amar Kra. He says it's based upon the fact that the verse says ki tamei nizro, because a person who was nazir who became tamei. It says mishum de betuma nazar, because since he accepted upon his nazirus while he was tamei, but if he accepted upon his nazirus when he was tahar and afterwards it became tamei, then we wouldn't say this law of yamim rishonim. So Abaye challenges, does it say, what about the case for a person who says, Hareini Nazir Me'ayom, Benitma Betchios Me'ah? So a person says, I'm going to be a Nazir for 100 days, and he becomes Nazir at the beginning of the 100, i.e. on day 1, so, sir, I might think that he knocks out his earlier days. Tamal Omar, Vayamim Arishonim Yiplu, Ashu Yamim Arishonim, and Vizeh and Arishonim. So Abai challenges Ula. We see in this case when the person accepts upon himself 100 days, he's not sozer, he doesn't have to bring a korban tumah. Even if he became tummy on day 1, he doesn't bring a korban tumah, even though there he started on the tahara, not in tumah. So the Gemara says, and then Vinitma b'sof mea, and let's say he became tameh at the end of 100 days. So the brisa continues. So anyway, from the first part, we see that this is the question. But Yachol, I might think, let's say he becomes tameh at the end of 100 days. Yachol yeso. So I might think he knocks out all 100 days that were beforehand. Tamalomer vayamim arishonim yiplu. We call the ika achronim. So let's say he became tameh on day 100. I might think you knock out all the 100 days beforehand. Verse says vayamim arishonim yiplu. The earlier days will fall. So this implies that there's later days. And so since this was day 100, he doesn't lose the earlier days. Nitma biyom mea chaser achas. Let's say it became tameh on day 99. So ser. I might think that he doesn't lose his earlier 98 days. Tamomer vayamim rishonim yiplu. Mikal de icha achronim. V'zeh yesol rishonim v'achronim. So we learn from here that it has to be later days that he hasn't counted. And this one who's on day 99, he has earlier days and later days, and so therefore he knocks out everything. So anyway, we see from here, Vaha, Abai finishes this question on Ula, but we see from here, B'tameh and Nazir, but we're talking about a case, Lo Matzis Amris, where we can't be talking about a case where a person was Tameh when he accepted Nazirus who was in the cemetery. You can't say that that's going on here. Midiktani, from the fact that it says, Hareini Nazir Meya v'nitma b'tchilas Meya. Because it says in the first case of this brisa, he was Nazir for 100 days and became Tameh at the beginning of the 100. Vikatani, and it says explicitly in the brisa, Ashilo Yamim Rishonim. So it says until he has earlier days. So in that case, we also say he doesn't bring the korban tumah. And this is a direct refutation of Ula's explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. To you, after the Gemara says, indeed, this is a refutation of Ula. So the Gemara says, how in Yamim Dika Amrina, and you say that you need 2 days according to Rabbi Eliezer in order to have to bring a korban tumah, but doesn't mean the nafak chad umatchilin train or dilma the nafik train umatchilin tosa. Do you say that you need to have 1 day completely in a state of purity, and now you start the second day, and when you become tameh on the second day, that's considered Yamim Rishonim, or maybe you have completed 2 days and you started the third day. But if you became Tameh on the second day, that's not called Yamim Rishonim because he only has 1 day in a state of Tahara. So the Gemara says, Abai didn't know the answer. Papa was asking this question, well, how he didn't know the answer. I'll say, Shaila Rabba, they came and they asked Rabba this question. Amraway, Rabba says, Yipluk Sif, meaning to say, it means Yiplu means any type of earlier days will fall away. It doesn't need to be 2 complete days. And that was the answer. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why do we need both drashos? So we need the Torah to write by Yamim Harishonim Yiplu. It needs to write Yamim, it needs to write Yiplu. Ikas Rachmana Yamim. If the Torah had just written Yamim below Kasav Yiplu and it didn't say Yiplu, Havamina, I would have said, if it had just written Yamim and it didn't say Yiplu, I would have said that you don't knock out anything until you do 2 complete days and you're on the third day. So therefore, Kasav Rachmana Yiplu. Because of Rachmana Yiplu, below Kasav Yamim, and if it just said Yiplu, but it didn't say days, I would have said even if it was only coming for 1 day, he knocks it out. Meaning if you even knocked it on the first day, you would have to bring korban tumah. So therefore, the Torah writes, so now we come up to the Mishnah on the bottom of your Tesam Beis, and what a pleasure! Anytime you have a Mishnah with Helena the Malka is just always great fun. So we're going to learn a little bit about Helena the Malka here. So first we say Misha Nazar. So a person who accepts upon himself as a Nazirus when he's outside the land of Israel, and he observed all of his days of Nazirus there, biblically speaking, he's fulfilled his Nazirus. But since the Chachamim made a decree about Tumah on the lands of the nations, therefore they penalized the person who was a Nazir outside the land of Israel, that even though he observed all his days of Nazirus and Chutz La'aretz, when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, he has to go and recount it, because we assume that his Nazirus was done in a state of Tumah. So in our Mishnah, there's going to be machokas amongst the Tanaim. When he comes to the land of Israel, how many days does he have to go back and count? Misha Nazir Nazirus Harbe, somebody who was outside the land of Israel, and he took upon himself a long Nazirus, i.e. longer than 30 days. Or some have the Giras of Nazirus Meruba, meaning a long Nazirus, V'hishlim es Nazirah. So when he completed his Nazirus outside the land of Israel. And then he came to the land of Israel to bring his karbanos, Beishamai Omrim, Nazir Shloshim Yom. Beishamai says we make him do another 30 days. We penalize him. Why do we penalize him? Because since the Tumah of the land of the nations is rabbinic, but we say there's Tumah Eretz Ha'amim. So Beishamai says we're only going to make him do 30 days. Beisil Omrim, Nazir Kivat Chila, Nazir B'Tchila, we say make him do everything over, meaning Beisil is strict, meaning to say we make him do the whole thing again. So if he did a Nazirus of 100 days, we make him do 100 days. Because since it's just like the rabbis say, that basically if you make a Nazir outside the land of Israel, it's like you're in a cemetery when you made a Nazir. So it doesn't count at all, and you have to go back and do it. Ma'isa Belina Malka, there was an incident with Queen Alina. Queen Alina, we know, is a descendant of the Chashmonayim, as it states in Baba Basra. And however, some say that she was a convert with her son Munbaz, and some that's how the Karen Ora says. Okay, anyway, so there was an incident with Queen Helena. Shalach ben Muhammad, her son went out to war. And she says, Im yavo b'ni min ha'milchama b'shalom and Zira sheva shanim. She says, if my son will come back from war in peace, I'll be a Nazarite for 7 years. And her son comes back from the war, and she fulfilled her vow. And on the last day of those 7 years, so Sheva Shanim, also Aretz. And at the end of those 7 years, she went up to Israel to bring her sacrifice. Ruah Beis Hillel, and Beis Hillel rules Shetei Nazira Ot Sheva Shanim Acharos. Beis Hillel said you have to be a Nazirite for another 7 years, because they said that if you're Nazirite outside the land of Israel, it doesn't count. And then at the end of 7 years, Nitmes, she messed up. She became Tameh. So it's not clear whether she'd have to bring the Karban Tumah then, because she really had fulfilled her part biblically. So therefore, she filled it. But anyway, because she became Tameh at that point, she had to go back and do it again. So then she became a Nazira for 21 years. Imagine that. And I'm Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says she was only in Nazarite for 14 years. So this is the story of Queen Helena, and it just shows a tremendous insight into why a person becomes a Nazir. She was saying, I'm going to do this so my son could be safe, but in the end, she had to be a Nazarite for 21 years. But we also see a powerful idea that there's a fundamental inherent contradiction between being a Nazarite outside the land of Israel. It's almost like it's not possible to fulfill the concept of being a Nazir outside the land of Israel. All right, we'll stop here. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them. Otherwise, I wish you all a great Shabbos.